Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver George Pickens had an awesome rookie season, but should you be buying him in Dynasty right now? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Magdziuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Magdziuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Magdziuk. Today, we are wrapping up our AFC North previews, getting ready for the 2023 season by talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Kate, I couldn't be more fired up for this show. Let's start with George Pickens, who I'm buying this offseason, but I've got a feeling you might not have the same opinion here. So what are your thoughts on George Pickens going into year two?
Here's the thing. Love George Pickens as a prospect. I think the Steelers got a great value. Like, this is coming from me, Kate Magdziuk, a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. Love George Pickens, the player, right? But I do have some concerns about buying into George Pickens for fantasy football. And for me, he's more of a hold. I'm not looking to pursue George Pickens right now. His current dynasty value in startups as of June, we just got a fresh batch of dynasty ADP over at dynastyleaguefootball.com. Currently wide receiver 34, which I think feels about right for me in terms of baking in the risk of the offense, baking in, I think, some of that volatility that we saw last year. He was a splash play highlight reel machine. That is what George Pickens did very well last year. He was a contested catch juggernaut. But what he did in between the catches that, made SportsCenter and the highlight reel bananas, toe drag swag, like what he did in between those catches impressed me a lot less. And I didn't think that, there was as much to like. I think there are a lot of people that are kind of sold on splash play George Pickens as opposed to, acknowledging that what he did in between those splash plays wasn't overly exciting and it didn't really elevate the offense much. Not that they were in a spot to easily elevate it, but
I think those points are 100% true. I think you go onto Twitter and you see his 5 best plays and you think that he had the same kind of rookie season as like a Chris Olave or Garrett Wilson, and he didn't, right? Like, he's not that type of receiver that you run your entire offense through. So I completely agree there. But the reason I'm buying George Pickens is really the price, Kate. You mentioned it. He's being drafted as wide receiver 34. I look around at the receivers going in that same range, and there's just nobody that has his combination of size, age, and upside of George Pickens. Like, let me go through some of the names. On the same offense, Deontay Johnson, who seems very likely not to be with the Pittsburgh Steelers after the season, didn't catch a touchdown last year. There's just no way that I'm taking Johnson over Pickens.
I think it's fair, but like when I'm looking at the players, just spoiler alert, Deontay Johnson's my buy. I think that Deontay Johnson is the better overall wide receiver. And quite honestly, the thought that he might be moving on to another offense where, he could continue to flourish as maybe a more efficient wide receiver one for a team, because that's been the big issue here. He's had the volume, he hasn't had the efficiency, but I think Deontay Johnson is a much safer range of outcomes, but I think he's also got a relatively high ceiling if he finds the right scheme.
I just don't think he's going to find a scheme that's going to give him more targets than what he's gotten over the last 3 years. And that's my issue. Is he's just he's so dependent on target volume where George Pickens is not. And that was what was so interesting about Pickens last year. Only 84 targets, but still had 801 yards. Like, he averaged 9.5 yards a target, which is just absolutely insane. we expect that efficiency to go down with more targets. But if we can get 110 targets and, average 8.5 yards per target, he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver really easily. And I think there's just a lot more touchdown upside with George Pickens. I'm going to run through some of the other names of just guys that are being drafted around him, like Jahan Dotson, Quentin Johnston, Amari Cooper, Zay Flowers, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins. Like I would just take George Pickens over all of those guys.
See, I'm probably leaning, I think, every single one of those wide receivers over George Pickens at this point. But again, I'm kind of still in on Deontay Johnson. So I'll save a little bit more of my argument there. But
it does feel like you have to pick a side, right? There's just, and we're going to talk about, I want to talk about Kenny Pickett here in a little bit, but I just don't see this offense supporting two receivers, a top 7 dynasty tight end right now in Pat Freiermuth, and a rushing attack because of Kenny Pickett. Unless they really open up this offense, which it doesn't sound likely. Even Matt Canada, their offensive coordinator this week, went on the radio and said, yeah, the organization told me that we need to not open it up and that we want to run the ball more. And this is kind of the style of team that we want to be. I think there's room for one of these receivers to be very fantasy relevant. And I'm betting on the upside and the age and the size and George Pickens. And you're betting on Deontay Johnson, who has been the more consistent option over the last couple of years.
Yep, that's definitely where it lies. And, Marcus, I think one of the best things that we can sort of point toward is Juju Smith-Schuster and what he accomplished outside of the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. We had seen year over year, declining production from Juju Smith-Schuster. He was that volume guy for the Pittsburgh Steelers, goes to Kansas City, has 1,000 receiving yards in his first season with the team, despite, having concussion issues, etc. But we saw him kind of return to the form that we had seen prior to the adjustments in this offense to account for, Ben Roethlisberger, the way that they tried to get the ball out just a little bit too fast for plays to develop so that they could avoid hits for Big Ben. Now the offense continues to restrict, and I do think that's going to affect Kenny Pickett's upside. That's going to affect George Pickens. But that's why if I'm going to choose one of these assets, it's going to be the guy that's going to continue to get target volume, but then has an escape route.
Yeah, we just disagree on this one. And we got some trades here, and I want to get your thoughts because I've got a feeling you're gonna be on the other side of some of these. So on Dynasty League football, we've got a trade of George Pickens for Chris Godwin straight up.
Chris Godwin.
I'll take Pickens. George Pickens in the pick 206 for Jahan Dotson.
Ooh, that's quite close for me.
Okay.
I'll probably take Pickens in the pick just because I don't think there's a huge difference between Jahan Dotson and Pickens.
I have Dotson ranked higher, but I agree. That's the same idea for me. Gibbs and George Pickens for Drake London.
I will take actually probably the Gibbs Pickens side.
Yeah, same one. This one's really interesting. George Pickens and Rashad Bateman for Michael Pittman.
I will take Pickens. And I'm actually surprised at how many of these trades I'm in on the Pickens side.
2 more for you. Brandon Ayuk for George Pickens straight up.
Ayuk. Easy.
That one's a little harder for me. I'd have to really think about that one. I'd have to have like a 3-hour meeting with my Dynasty staff to figure that one out. Last one, Miles Sanders for George Pickens.
I will take Miles Sanders in a win now.
I think that's fair. I think I would just take George Pickens in a vacuum, but if you really need running back depth, I get it. All right, let's talk about Najee Harris, who, Kate, I know you are a massive fan of. Should you be buying or selling the third-year running back from Alabama? Next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That is up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. They've got a million other bets you can make. You can bet on NFL futures. You can bet on MVPs. You can bet on comeback player of the year, all on FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, we are back talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers and players that we are buying, selling, and holding this offseason. Kate, I want to talk to you about Najee Harris because when we were kind of preparing for this show, you mentioned that you were kind of buying Najee this offseason, but I think you've had some second thoughts here. So I want your full range of emotions here with the Steelers lead back.
Disclosure, I'm a huge Najee Harris fan. Was far and away my RB1 in that class. And, I've been all in on Najee Harris. I was, and still am generally concerned about the lack of efficiency that we've seen from Najee Harris, especially after last season. But current ADP RB12, and when I'm thinking of, like RB12 and I'm looking at, some of the running backs that might be drafted around him, it feels like RB12 is kind of about right for Najee Harris. But every time I come back to Najee and I look at his potential in terms of potential volume, especially in the year to come, especially with the knowledge, Marcus, like you alluded to previously, like this is a Mike Tomlin team. Despite all of the reports that they want to get, other running backs involved and get them on the field more, this is a Mike Tomlin offense, and he's always favored the one running back system. And there's no doubt that one running back is absolutely Najee Harris. But, looking at the range of players like Nick Chubb, who 27 years old, has a high touch total, going into this next season. Josh Jacobs, plenty of question marks. Is he even going to play this season if they don't get a long-term deal done with the Raiders? There's a lot of question marks with all of the running backs right around Najee Harris in this range. And I don't know that there's any other running back with similar upside in terms of touches. Like Harris leads all of the NFL in terms of highest percent of team scrimmage touches since 2021. He's got just, carries for days since he was drafted first among all running backs in terms of total carries, 6 in rushing yards, first in scrimmage touches, 6 in scrimmage yards. He's not been efficient, but again, the volume keeps me coming back for more. The knowledge that the Steelers have continued to work on their offensive line. Broderick Jones, huge addition this year. And then last but not least, I want to point out the foot injury that Najee Harris was managing throughout last season. Suffered it in training camp. Didn't actually miss time. Like he played through it, but
he
was playing most of the season with like a steel plate in his shoe, which I do think hampered his just overall ability to move, which again, that's kind of the point of the steel plate, right? Is to like provide stability and limit movement there. I think we saw that affect him. And right after that bye, definitely saw, an increase in production. And that second half of the season saw an increase in efficiency, had 6 rushing touchdowns in the second half of the year following the bye. I just think he's going to be healthier this year based on the information we have right now. And, I do think, how many running backs are you going to get at RB12 with the potential to literally lead the NFL in touches in the 2023 season?
And it's why Najee is ultimately a hold for me. You mentioned after the bye, right? From week 10 on, he averaged about 75 rushing yards per game, 13 receiving yards. The efficiency, not great, 4.1 yards a carry, but dramatically better than what it was in the first half of the year. I just think the Steelers want to run the crap out of the ball, right? And I think they want to get Jaylen Warren more involved. But even last year, like when we saw Jaylen Warren playing well down that stretch, Najee was getting over 18 carries a game. Like they're going to get him his work. And I think at RB 11, as you mentioned, that's kind of right where I think he deserves to be ranked. I would take Josh Jacobs over Najee. He's the same age. He's just been more productive. I get that. I would take Nick Chubb, better offensive line, better offense altogether. But you look at a couple of the names behind him, I like Tony Pollard and Ramondre Stevenson better, but Javonte Williams and J.K. Dobbins and Derrick Henry and DeAndre Swift, I would rather have Najee than all of those players. So I think if you drafted Najee with, I guess that would have been the, probably number 1, number 2, maybe number 3 pick in your rookie drafts in 2021. I'm just holding him unless you get a sweetheart offer where you get, you're able to move him for a really good receiver. It's probably best just to ride it out because it's really hard to predict which running backs are going to get 20 touches a game, and Najee's one of them.
Yeah, this is just looking at his startup ADP. This is really the lowest it's been. Like this past off season, this is the lowest it's been in his entire career. It feels
That's why he might be a value now.
I do think he's starting to become a value. Like most recent dynasty trade available right now on Dynasty League Football. Najee Harris straight up for Isaiah Pacheco.
Yeah, I mean, get out of here with that, right?
Get out. Like there is 100% good reasons to inquire at least about the pricing of Najee Harris and put some feelers out there because you really don't know. And the range of temperatures, I feel like for Najee Harris is ice cold or red hot. And
let me ask you this, Kate. Do you think it's June 22nd right now. Do you think his ADP is more likely to rise or fall before the first training camp practice starts?
My overall vibe is probably fall.
That would be my thoughts, just because we've already seen a lot of Jaylen Warren buzz over the last couple days. Maybe that buzz gets a little bit louder, and that would be the time to pounce on Najee Harris, because you mentioned the low ADP. I won't be surprised if we see, once Tony Pollard's a little healthier, once it's clear the Patriots aren't signing another running back, we see Najee kind of fall to RB12, RB13.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Before we move on to your guy, Kenny Pickett, any thoughts? You mentioned Deontay Johnson is a buy for you. Do you want to kind of expand on that?
Yeah, I think again, I talked about the safety. I really want to point out just how bad this offense was in 2022 in terms of the passing production, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit with Kenny Pickett here. But when you're looking at Deontay Johnson's career this far, 2022 really was the true outlier. Prior to 2022, never had fewer than 5 touchdowns in a season. Was always productive after the catch. We saw a huge drop in terms of his production, yards after the catch per reception. Saw a big drop in his yards per route run efficiency, a huge drop in his passer rating when targeted. But the volume is still there. I still think he's this team's wide receiver 1. And if he moves on to another offense, he might not get 140 targets a season. But I also think, if he moves on to a better offense, he might not need them. I'm betting on talent. I think he's one of the more proficient route runners in this league. And again, bet on talent. But this year, scored 0 touchdowns and still finished as a top 30 wide receiver. The floor is very safe, and he's performed as a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy before, largely thanks to volume, but the potential's there.
I don't know. I just don't see it. He's one of the guys that I'm probably okay trading away, just because I think there's a good chance he's not on Pittsburgh next year. And we've seen, like, with these receivers that turn 27, 28, 29, teams just aren't all that interested in giving you a lot of money and making you a focal point of the offense, especially if they didn't draft you. So he's one we'll agree to disagree on. I'm buying George Pickens. I'm buying the upside, but none of that matters unless Kenny Pickett turns out to be a franchise quarterback. What's Kenny Pickett's upside going into year 2? We discuss that next. All right, Kate, to wrap up this show, we're going to talk about Kenny Pickett, who had an up and down rookie season. I think it was more down than what people want to admit. He finished the year. He started the season, I believe, 13 games, finished with 7 passing touchdowns in 13 games. Okay. Had 9 interceptions during that time. But people seem to be really excited about Kenny Pickett going into year 2. He's currently being drafted as QB 22 in your dynasty leagues. Kate, what are your thoughts on Kenny Pickett?
There's no upside here for me. And that is why I'm selling. Even if Kenny Pickett ends up being the guy for the Steelers, I'm continually asking myself, what is the upside? Kenny Pickett, 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions last year, cleaned up the turnovers towards the end of last year. Had a really, really rough start to his career. 7 of those interceptions came in his first 4 games. Wasn't pretty, but I think a lot of the lack of turnovers, etc., that we saw from Kenny Pickett, he also wasn't necessarily, making a ton of big plays. Again, in between those splash plays, those incredible throws where he connects with George Pickens and it's a highlight reel. It didn't feel like there was a lot of consistency in between those plays. Started the season off actually with a relatively high completion percentage despite the turnovers, which is interesting. To close out the year, weeks 10 on, 59% completion rate, still 177 pass yards per game, 12 rush yards per game. I don't totally understand the value from a fantasy perspective. He's got small hands. He's playing in the AFC North, weather.
And one of the stats that I've seen, and listen, I work for this company, so I get it. It's like Kenny Pickett from week 10 on was one of the highest graded quarterbacks in the league. He had the least amount of turnover worthy throws, only had 1 interception. I kind of think Pittsburgh changed the way that they played offense after the bye. It's, hey, Pickett killed us in multiple games. If he doesn't turn the ball over 3 times against the Jets, we win that game and we make the playoffs, right? Mm-hmm. If he doesn't turn the ball over 3 times against the Dolphins in a 10-16 loss, right? They were right down, ready to score the go-ahead touchdown. He threw an interception. They got the ball back. He threw another interception on the next drive. I think after that point of the season, Pittsburgh was basically like, you know what? We're going to make him a game manager. You're going to throw safe passes, and on 3rd and long, you can chuck the ball down the field to George Pickens, but that's our quarterback. And we kind of saw that play out in the numbers, right? 1 interception, but he averaged 6.4 yards an attempt during that stretch. That's what's concerning to me is if he's not going to throw the ball a lot, you better be efficient. And if you're not going to be efficient, you better throw the ball a lot. I just don't see both of those things happening for him this year.
Yeah, weeks 11 on average, just 30 pass attempts per game. The lack of volume there, and I think the fact that Matt Canada is sort of doubling down. This is the trajectory of offense we want to be playing, and this is the direction they're kind of heading in. And I mean, it's always been sort of like the culture of Mike Tomlin, right? He's a defensive-minded coach. Steel Curtain, TJ Watt, they thrive on defense. Minka Fitzpatrick, and the best compliment to that defense and what they're doing on that side of the ball is just controlling the clock, controlling time of possession, and running the ball and making small gains. And I don't think that's conducive to fantasy points.
Now, I will say the one reason why I'm not totally against buying Kenny Pickett right now is the Pittsburgh Steelers pride themselves in being an organization that doesn't panic, right? And they play the long game, and they're going to be patient, right? So even if Pickett were to struggle or just to produce numbers that were the same as what he did last year, I don't see them all of a sudden moving on and drafting another quarterback in the first round or signing a high price veteran. Like, for better or worse, this is going to be Kenny Pickett's team. Would you agree?
I agree, but I also don't know, like, what does that mean? Like, what
Well, I
does
think for a
Kenny
dynasty, that means
Pickett being the
stability.
starter actually mean for your fantasy teams? Because you might be getting, 13 to 16 fantasy points per game.
It just depends on your, like, if you're playing in obviously a two quarterback league or a super flex league, there is some value in having a quarterback you just know is going to be the starter. There's just not a lot of instability there. And maybe you're hoping as he gets a little bit older, as the offensive line improves, if George Pickens takes a step, that he can improve. But I do value that part of it quite a bit. It's one of the reasons, like, I think Daniel Jones, who I'm not a huge fan of, I feel much better about Daniel Jones now because of the long-term commitment that the Giants have to him.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, what are you looking to value, right? Are you looking to value just like the safety of
Yep.
knowing that you're gonna, post, 10 plus points? But like in a super flex, I largely think that Kenny Pickett is going to be overvalued. I think, like to close out the year, right? Cleaned up the turnovers, 10 fantasy points, 13 fantasy points, 13 fantasy points, 10.9, 11.9. Like, that is the production that you got out of Kenny Pickett. And if we're
Sure.
in a super flex, you might as well trade Kenny Pickett for a higher value positional player that might offer you some upside, because I don't see it here with Pickett.
I don't necessarily see it either, but we'll see. Kenny Pickett is one of the more hype players going into the year. We'll see if he has a breakout season. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every day. Every dayers. We will be back on Monday to talk about the AFC North, or sorry, the AFC South. We're going to be discussing the Houston Texans, so make sure you tune in for that. Go follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Magic. I'm at Marcus_Mosier. We are free and available on all platforms, and we'll see you right back here on Monday.